In the spring of that ill-omened year, buried deep within the mist-drenched hollows of McCreary County, Kentucky, a discovery surfaced that would permanently scar the history of rural America. What began as a simple welfare check ordered by county officials unfolded into one of the most unsettling accounts of family isolation ever recorded in the United States. Deputy Sheriff Harold Combs, who had been patrolling the mountain backroads for more than 15 years, knew every twisting dirt trail, every collapsed barn left to rot, every forgotten graveyard scattered through these ancient hills. Yet nothing from his long experience could have braced him for what awaited him on the morning of April 17, 1962. The initial concern had come from the postmaster in the tiny town of Whitley City. For 3 straight months, mail addressed to the Mercer property had come back unclaimed. Boxes of government surplus cheese and powdered milk sat molding in the back storage room of the post office. Someone, at last, needed to go check on the family. The Mercer homestead rested at the end of a nearly impassable trail almost 14 miles from the nearest stretch of paved road. As Deputy Combs maneuvered his patrol car through the thick forest, the trees seemed to press inward around him, forming the shadowed aisles of a cathedral shaped by nature itself. Dogwood blossoms fluttered across his windshield like somber confetti drifting at a funeral. And when he finally broke through into the clearing, the sight that met him defied all sense. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You won't want to miss our exclusive investigations into America's darkest family secrets that mainstream media refuses to cover. Hit subscribe now to join our community of truth seekers. The main house, clearly once a solid structure, now sagged like a wounded creature. Part of the roof had caved in, and kudzu vines were slowly consuming the eastern wall. But it wasn't the ruin that caused Deputy Combs to freeze where he stood. On the front porch, arranged in a flawless line, were 7 figures. 7 men of different heights but disturbingly similar faces. They stood perfectly motionless, staring at the approaching deputy with expressions somehow both vacant and inquisitive. Combs later told the county coroner that the men's faces looked as though they were built from the same mold, as if God had wearied himself and simply copied the same template 7 times. Their eyes were a watery, pale blue set too closely together. Their noses hooked sharply leftward. Pronounced foreheads pushed outward, and their lower jaws receded just enough to give each man a permanent look of puzzled bewilderment. These were the Mercer brothers, isolated on that mountain longer than anyone in the county could clearly recall. The eldest stepped forward. His age could have been anywhere between 50 and 70, it was almost impossible to guess. His spine arched so severely he had to look upward from an odd angle just to meet the deputy's gaze. When he spoke, the words escaped slowly, as though uttering each syllable demanded real effort. "You come about Mama?" he asked. A chill slid down Deputy Combs' spine despite the warm April air. "Where is your mother, sir?" The man, later identified as Ezekiel Mercer, lifted an arm and pointed toward a small building behind the main house. It looked like an old smokehouse, its wooden planks blackened by decades of curing meat. Inside that smokehouse, Deputy Combs found something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his days. Hester Mercer, matriarch of the family, sat propped upright in a wooden chair. She had been dead for nearly 4 months. During that time, her sons had continued bringing her meals, talking to her each day, asking her approval for their decisions. They had no understanding that she had passed on. The investigation that followed would expose a family history so knotted, so purposely obscured from the outside world, that even seasoned social workers struggled to assemble the full truth. Yet what emerged through months of interviews, medical examinations, and combing through court records painted a portrait of generational tragedy reaching back almost a century. The Mercer family had first come to these Kentucky mountains in 1871. Josiah Mercer, a Confederate veteran, relocated his wife and 3 children to this remote hollow to escape what he believed was the moral corruption of the outside world. He considered the family bloodline pure, superior, and intended to keep it that way. What began as an ideology under Josiah hardened into tradition among his descendants. The brothers encountered by Deputy Combs that April morning were the products of 4 generations of closed-circle unions. Their father, Cornelius Mercer, had taken his own sister as companion. Their mother Hester, both aunt and mother to the 7 sons, was born from a separate pairing within the same extended family. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. The results of such prolonged genetic isolation were etched across their bodies. Medical exams at Eastern Kentucky State Hospital revealed conditions the physicians could scarcely believe. A number of the brothers suffered severe intellectual impairment. 2 were completely deaf. 1 had been born with his internal organs reversed, a condition so unusual that the doctor had only ever encountered it in textbooks. But their open confession stunned investigators most of all. When questioned about their family line, the brothers explained everything with a calm matter-of-fact tone, unaware that their family practices were considered abhorrent anywhere beyond their hollow. To them, this was simply how life had always functioned. Ezekiel, the eldest and most articulate, stated their father taught them that outsiders carried illnesses, of both the body and the soul. Marriage beyond the family was forbidden. The blood must remain untouched. The interviews lasted 3 days. The brothers described births and deaths that were never recorded, siblings who had died in infancy far more often than those who survived. They spoke of the only daughter born to their parents, a girl sent away to distant relatives because she had begun questioning the family customs. Authorities didn't fully believe them at first. Surely these men, limited in intellect and deprived of formal education, must be mistaken or confused. How could something so shocking persist in 20th century America? How could a family remain so cut off that they developed their own concept of morality, their own system of rules? But the evidence was unavoidable, the medical results, the family Bible with its unsettling entries, the photographs showing generation after generation of faces growing more similar. No one could deny it. Eventually, the Mercer brothers were placed under state guardianship. They were moved to a care facility in Lexington, where they spent the rest of their lives. None adapted wholly to life beyond the hollow that had shaped them. Ezekiel died in 1974, repeatedly begging to be taken back to the family land, wanting to be buried beside his mother. His request was refused. In 1968, the county demolished the Mercer homestead, declaring it a health hazard. The land was absorbed into the Daniel Boone National Forest. Nothing remains today to mark the spot where 4 generations lived and died in deliberate exile. Yet the story of the Mercer brothers did not end with the destruction of the home. The questions raised by their case continued echoing through hospitals, universities, and welfare offices for decades. How many other families had slipped into isolation in the vast wilderness of Appalachia? What obligations did society carry toward those forgotten in remote corners of the nation? And perhaps most troubling of all, what had truly happened to all the children who never survived? Make sure you're subscribed to this channel. This story is only beginning, and the secrets woven through the Mercer bloodline run deeper than anyone dared imagine. Subscribe so you don't miss what unfolds next, because the truth is even more disturbing than the discovery itself. To fully understand how the Mercer family sank into such absolute isolation, we have to travel nearly a century back, long before Deputy Combs stumbled upon the hollow. The seeds of this tragedy were planted right after the Civil War, watered by fear, nourished by paranoia, and allowed to flourish through generations of self-imposed separation. Josiah Mercer returned from the war in 1865 a broken man. Everything he once believed in, the old order, the way of life he knew since boyhood, had been destroyed. The Confederacy's fall signaled, in his mind, a new era he wanted no part of. He gathered his wife Martha and their 3 children and journeyed deep into the mountains, traveling for weeks until they found a hollow remote enough that Josiah believed no outsider could ever follow. The early years were brutal. Martha bore 2 more children in that period, both died before reaching 1 year of age. The harshness of mountain life, the lack of medical care, the total absence of assistance, all took their toll. But Josiah didn't waver. Instead of seeing these tragedies as a signal to rejoin society, he saw them as trials meant to strengthen his resolve. Slowly, he crafted a worldview that would poison the family tree for generations. In Josiah's mind, the people beyond the mountains were tainted, physically and morally corrupted. Only by keeping the family bloodline untouched could they survive the calamities he believed were coming. This philosophy took its most horrifying form in 1879, when Josiah arranged for his eldest son, Abraham, to take his own sister, Ruth, as companion. Martha, horrified, attempted to flee with Ruth under cover of night. They made it less than 3 miles before Josiah caught them. What occurred that night was never explicitly recorded, but Martha never attempted to leave again. She died 2 years later, the official cause pneumonia, though Josiah's journals suggest otherwise. Abraham and Ruth bore 8 children over the next 15 years, only 3 lived to adulthood. The others died from conditions clearly tied to close relations, or from mysterious ailments the family blamed on curses or ill fortune. Josiah lived long enough to watch his twisted doctrine cement itself into tradition. He died in 1901 at 73, having never left the hollow after first settling there. His last words, written by Abraham in the family Bible, were, "Keep the blood pure." Abraham treated those words as sacred law. He raised his surviving children, 2 sons and a daughter, to believe that marrying an outsider was the worst sin imaginable. When his daughter Patience showed interest in a hunter who wandered into the hollow, Abraham chased the man off with a gun. Patience, just 16, was then paired with her older brother Cornelius, who was 22. From this union came the generation that would eventually include Hester, the woman whose body Deputy Combs later found in that smokehouse nearly 60 years afterward. The cycle continued relentlessly. Each generation grew more isolated, more convinced of its imagined purity, and more visibly affected by the consequences of their practices. The family developed its own dialect, part archaic English, part invented language outsiders struggled to comprehend. They formed their own calendar, their own holidays, and unique rituals for birth and death. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. By the time Cornelius took Hester as his companion in 1908, the family had been cut off from the world for almost 40 years. No Mercer had attended school, seen a physician, paid taxes, or acknowledged any higher authority. Cornelius and Hester produced 11 children over 23 years. 7 sons survived. The remaining 4 were marked in the Bible with only the phrase, "Return to God." These 7 sons were the men standing on the porch in April of 1962. The world beyond the hollow changed dramatically over those decades. 2 world wars were fought. The Great Depression rose and fell. Electricity, automobiles, telephones, all reshaped American life. People dreamed of sending men to the moon. Yet none of this touched the Mercers. They continued farming their tiny parcel, hunting the surrounding forest, and following Josiah's century-old rules. Cornelius died in 1944, leaving Hester to govern her 7 sons. By then, Ezekiel was already 30, while the youngest, Solomon, was 15. Hester ruled with absolute authority. She dictated their meals, work, prayers, and rest. She read nightly from the family Bible, emphasizing Josiah's chosen verses, the ones demanding separation from the world and warning of the dangers outsiders brought. The brothers had no reason to question her. They had never encountered another way of life. Their mother's commands were the only law they knew. When Hester's health failed in the fall of 1961, her sons were helpless. They didn't comprehend death, or rather, they had experienced it so often in childhood that they treated it as a simple return to God, requiring no intervention. As she weakened, they continued feeding her even when she could no longer eat, speaking to her as her responses faded. When she finally died in December 1961, they simply maintained their routine. They had never been taught that death meant departure, not sleep. For 4 months, the Mercer brothers lived beside their mother's body, preserving the illusion she was still among them. They asked her permission for every decision, told her about the spring crops, and wished her good night before bed. Only the arrival of Deputy Combs shattered that illusion. In the weeks after their discovery, medical professionals faced an ethical quandary. These men were victims, shaped entirely by circumstances they never chose and never understood. Their lives, minds, and bodies had been molded by a century of inherited isolation. They could not be punished for practices they didn't know were wrong. The county prosecutor was pressured by the state to bring charges, but against whom? Josiah, Abraham, Cornelius, the architects of the tragedy, were long dead. Hester herself was gone. And so, in the end, no one was charged. The brothers were declared wards of the state. Too impaired to ever stand trial, too damaged to be held accountable for the circumstances of their own birth, the Mercer brothers were taken from the only home they had ever known and placed inside an institution where the remainder of their lives would be spent among strangers speaking a language they could barely comprehend. Yet the story of the Mercer family was far from finished. In the months after the brothers were removed, investigators uncovered additional findings that deepened the tragedy even further. Hidden beneath the main house's floorboards lay a cache of journals. These were not the carefully kept records of births and unions found in the family Bible. These were personal writings stretching across nearly 70 years, containing secrets no one was prepared to confront. The journals recovered from beneath the homestead filled 3 wooden crates. They were written in a cramped, difficult hand, the result of poor education and fading eyesight. Many pages had been stained or warped by time and moisture, but enough remained legible to reconstruct a narrative far more complicated than investigators initially imagined. The earliest journals belonged to Martha, Josiah's wife, the same woman who attempted to escape with her daughter Ruth in 1879. Her writings revealed a mind far from a willing participant in her husband's twisted plans. He speaks of purity as though it were a virtue, Martha wrote in a March 1877 entry. But all I see is the narrowing of what could be, the closing of doors that should stay open. My children deserve a chance to see the world, not live as prisoners to their father's fears. Martha's journals charted her escalating horror as Josiah's intentions became clear. She wrote of arguments that ended with violence, of nights spent in tears while her husband quoted scripture to justify his demands. She documented her desperate attempt to save Ruth, and the brutal consequences that followed. The final entry in Martha's journal appeared just 3 weeks before her recorded death in 1881. I have failed my children, she wrote. God forgive me, for they will not have the chance to forgive themselves. But it was the journals from later generations that proved the most revealing. Among the collection was a complete diary written by a woman named Patience, daughter of Abraham and Ruth, and later paired with her own brother Cornelius. Patience's writings ran from 1898, when she was only 14, through 1923, the year she vanished entirely from family records. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Her journals revealed a woman of striking intelligence and heartbreaking self-awareness. I know what we are, Patience wrote in 1905, 3 years before she was joined with Cornelius. I have seen the children who do not live. The bodies buried quietly in the night without prayer or ceremony. I know we are dwindling with every generation, that the blood my grandfather worshipped is turning into poison. Patience described her attempts to educate herself using the few books that existed in the hollow. She learned to read from the family Bible, then moved on to the handful of other texts that had somehow found their way into the house, an old farmer's almanac, an 1850s medical manual, and a warped, water-damaged copy of Shakespeare's collected works. It was the medical manual that opened her eyes to the truth of her family's condition. The book speaks of breeding too closely within animal stock, she wrote in 1911. It describes weakened offspring, deformity, and early death. When I read these lines, I see my own children described on the page. By then Patience had already borne 4 children. 2 had survived, Hester, and a boy named Josiah after the patriarch. The other 2 died within weeks of birth, their small bodies marked by conditions Patience now understood as the inevitable outcome of generations of closed unions. Her journals revealed an attempt, perhaps the only true attempt, to change her family's fate. In 1915, she secretly contacted a traveling preacher moving through the region. She entrusted him with letters addressed to officials in the state capital, begging for intervention and describing the conditions in which her family lived. The letters were never delivered. The preacher had dismissed Patience as a madwoman. Her sealed letters were returned to her months later, unread. Along with them he included a note advising that she pray more and worry less about matters beyond her understanding. Patience continued her diary entries until 1923. The final pages grew increasingly frantic, her handwriting wild. Cornelius suspects, she wrote in her second-to-last entry. He questions the time I spend with my papers. I have hidden them as best I can, but he has eyes everywhere. The boys tell him everything they see. Her last entry, dated September 3, 1923, held only one sentence. If these words are read someday, know that I tried. After that date, Patience vanished from all family records. The family Bible listed no death, no burial. She simply disappeared. When investigators questioned the surviving Mercer brothers about her fate, they claimed no memory of their grandmother at all. It was as if she had been erased entirely. The discovery of these journals forced investigators to re-evaluate everything they believed about the Mercer family. This was not merely a story of isolation and ignorance. There had been voices of resistance, women who recognized the horror unfolding and attempted to halt it. Their efforts were crushed, their memories scrubbed away, their warnings hidden beneath the floorboards for decades. If you feel the weight of Patience's struggle, if her desperate attempts to save her family moved you, pause this video now and leave a comment saying, Patience, your words were finally heard. Let her know that after a lifetime of silence, someone listened. The journals also referenced other relatives who had been removed or silenced across the years. There were mentions of a son who tried to flee in 1889 and was forcibly returned. There were whispers of a daughter sent away to distant kin, the same sister the Mercer brothers had mentioned during their interviews. Investigators tracked this sister, hoping she might reveal more about the family's history. After months of searching, they found a woman named Constance living in a small Ohio town. She was 73 and had not spoken about her birth family in more than 50 years. Constance agreed to meet investigators only once. She arrived wearing black, as though in mourning. When asked about her childhood, she remained silent for nearly 10 minutes before she spoke. I was sent away because I questioned things, she finally said. I wanted to know why we couldn't go to school like other children. Why we never saw anyone from outside the hollow. Why so many babies were buried in the garden behind the house. Constance had been 12 when she was placed on a wagon and taken 50 miles to a train station. She was handed a letter of introduction to relatives in Ohio and told never to return. Mother Hester cried when I left, Constance remembered. But father forbid her from speaking against his decision. He said I was contaminated, that the outside world had gotten into my thoughts. In Ohio, Constance built a new life. She married, had children, and never spoke of where she came from. Her children grew up knowing nothing of the hollow, nothing of her brothers, nothing of the twisted family tree that created her. I tried to forget, she said. For 50 years I tried to pretend I had no past, that I simply arrived in Ohio fully formed. But you never truly escape where you come from. The hollow is still with me, in my dreams, in the way I flinch when people ask about my family. When investigators told her about her brother's discovery, about her mother's death, about the journals, Constance wept. But she refused to visit her brothers in the institution. She said she could not bear to look into faces so much like her own and confront the life she escaped. Tell them I'm sorry, she said as the interview concluded. Tell them I thought of them every day. And tell them I'm grateful, grateful I was sent away, grateful I had the chance to live differently. Constance died in 1971, 8 years after that meeting. In her will, she requested that any references to her birth family be removed from her papers. She wanted her children and grandchildren to remember only the version of herself she had crafted, an ordinary woman from Ohio with no extraordinary origins, no horrific past. But secrets, as the Mercer family learned, do not die simply because the people who carried them do. In the years after the Mercer brothers were institutionalized, their case drew the attention of researchers from several major universities. The chance to study the effects of prolonged family isolation on human genetics was rare, and the Mercer story presented a nearly unprecedented opportunity. Dr. Harrison Wells, a geneticist at the University of Kentucky, spent 3 years studying the brothers. His findings, published in 1967, painted a detailed portrait of the biological consequences of the family's closed-circle unions. The Mercer subjects display an extraordinarily high concentration of recessive traits, Dr. Wells wrote. Conditions that appear once in every 10,000 births in the general population occur in this family with a frequency suggesting almost complete genetic homogeneity. Their physical traits were the most obvious. All 7 brothers shared the same facial characteristics that had so unsettled Deputy Combs: the close-set eyes, the hooked noses, the receding chins. These were visible markers of what scientists later called pedigree collapse, when a family tree folds inward so many times that its members become more genetically similar than typical siblings, almost like multiples of the same child. But the internal abnormalities were even more severe. Medical imaging, a technology still relatively new in the early 1960s, revealed a range of internal defects. 2 brothers had significantly underdeveloped kidneys. 3 showed heart defects that somehow had not yet proved fatal. 1 brother's brain scan displayed structures the radiologist described as unlike anything he had seen in 2 decades of practice. Their intellectual abilities varied, but all tested well below average. Ezekiel, the eldest and the most capable, functioned at a level similar to a 12-year-old child. Solomon, the youngest of them all, could barely manage the simplest tasks on his own and seemed incapable of forming fresh memories. Dr. Wells emphasized repeatedly that none of these conditions stemmed from a single defective gene. Instead, they were the natural result of countless minor flaws piling up over generation after generation. Each internal pairing within the family intensified whatever damaging recessive traits the original ancestors had unknowingly possessed. By the time the 7 Mercer brothers entered the world, there was no genetic place left for any weakness to hide. What we see in the Mercer bloodline is the inevitable outcome of ignoring the biological wisdom that nearly every human society developed independently, Dr. Wells wrote. Prohibitions against close kin unions are not mere cultural preferences, they are hard-won safeguards against biological disaster. The researchers also reconstructed whatever remained of the family's reproductive history. Drawing from the family Bible, the hidden journals beneath the floorboards, and the brothers' own fragmented testimonies, scholars estimated that roughly 60% of all Mercer infants died over 4 consecutive generations. The number was astonishing. At the same time in the general U.S. population, infant mortality ranged between 10 and 15%, and had been steadily dropping as medical care improved. Yet within the Mercer line, the number held firm, perhaps even worsened, as the genetic damage compounded. The study generated significant attention in scientific circles, but it also forced difficult ethical debates. Some argued that the Mercer clan had essentially become an accidental long-term experiment on the effects of extreme inbreeding, the kind of research that, if intentionally conducted, would have been monstrously unethical, yet had occurred naturally over nearly a century. Others insisted that the scientific community risked exploiting the Mercer tragedy, turning the brothers into specimens rather than treating them as victims deserving empathy. Dr. Wells addressed these criticisms directly in his publication. The Mercers did not choose this life, he insisted. They were born into a system established long before them, a system from which they had neither the understanding nor the ability to escape. Our purpose in studying them is not exploitation, it is prevention. Scientific observation continued until the final Mercer brother died in 1981. Over close to 20 years, researchers documented the slow progression of their conditions, the worsening of their bodies, their fading mental functions, and eventually their deaths, each tied to the genetic legacy they had inherited. Solomon died first, in 1969, succumbing to kidney failure at the age of 40. He never adapted to institutional life and spent most of his late years in a near unresponsive state, barely aware of anything around him. The remaining brothers passed away at irregular intervals, one in 1971, 2 more in 1974, another in 1977. Ezekiel, the eldest, outlived expectations by surviving until 1978, dying of heart failure, a condition that had claimed many of his kin before him. According to the records, the last surviving brother, Isaiah, a man rarely mentioned in any report, died in 1981 at age 58. He spent his final years in total silence, refusing to speak to staff or fellow patients. He communicated only through nods and gestures, having apparently concluded that the world beyond the hollow was not worth speaking to. With Isaiah's death, the direct Mercer bloodline ended. No children remained. No descendants existed to carry the family name. The experiment Josiah Mercer set in motion in 1871 came to its final conclusion, not with the purified lineage he had imagined, but with complete extinction. The Mercer property, absorbed into national forest land after the homestead was demolished, eventually returned to wilderness. Whatever faint traces of habitation remained, foundation stones, rusted farm tools, a small cemetery of unmarked graves, were slowly devoured by the forest. Today, only those who already know where to look can locate the site. Its coordinates do not appear in public records. The Forest Service refuses to acknowledge it. Mercer Hollow has become a forgotten scar in the landscape, a wound nature has spent decades trying to seal. Yet memories linger. At the University of Kentucky, boxes of research notes sit untouched, awaiting scholars who might someday reopen the case. In a basement of the McCreary County Courthouse, the official reports from 1962 gather dust. And in the minds of the few still alive who witnessed the discovery, the image of 7 men standing on a collapsing porch refuses to fade. The Mercer case transformed how Kentucky, and many Appalachian states, approached the monitoring of isolated families. In the wake of the discovery, social workers were granted broader authority to investigate claims of extreme isolation. Training programs taught officials how to recognize potential signs of genetic complications and hidden inbreeding. Whether these reforms prevented future Mercer families is unknowable. The Appalachian Mountains still hold countless remote hollows and valleys where families live far from any government eye. Isolation alone does not guarantee tragedy. Tradition alone does not produce pathology. But the possibility remains. And as long as places exist where families can vanish from the public record, where children can live and die uncounted, the story of the Mercer brothers stands as a warning of what absolute isolation can create. More than 60 years have passed since Deputy Harold Combs first drove up that mountain road and saw 7 men staring at him from a decaying porch. The world has changed in unimaginable ways since then. The level of isolation that allowed the Mercer family to remain hidden for nearly a century would be nearly impossible today, in an age of satellite images, cell towers, digital databases, and constant documentation from birth to death. Yet the questions the case raised still remain. How do we respect personal freedom while still protecting the vulnerable? How do we prevent isolation from turning into generational catastrophe? How do we ensure that children like the Mercer brothers, born into circumstances they neither chose nor understood, receive the protection they deserve? These questions are not merely historical. In recent decades, authorities have found families living in near total separation from society, their children showing signs of profound deprivation. Communities too have been discovered practicing forms of insularity reminiscent of the Mercers. The differences between those cases and the Mercer story are matters of scale, not kind. The Mercer clan represents the extreme end, a century-long example of what happens when a family severs all ties with the world. But smaller versions still appear today, children without schooling, without healthcare, without any chance to develop into their full potential. Deputy Combs, who uncovered the family in 1962, lived until 1994. In his later interviews, he never found the right words to fully describe the experience. "I've seen many things as a lawman," he said shortly before his death. "Violence, cruelty, the worst of what people can do. But nothing ever prepared me for those 7 men on that porch. They weren't dangerous. They weren't mean. They were just broken. Broken by a system they didn't choose, and couldn't escape." Combs spent the rest of his career fighting for improved resources in rural areas, for more frequent welfare checks and stronger ties between isolated families and the services designed to help them. He never forgot the Mercer brothers and often wondered whether he might have found them earlier had he looked harder. The Mercer case also reshaped the way Americans viewed their own history. It challenged the romanticized idea of Appalachian isolation, the notion that families living apart from society were simply preserving a purer, simpler life. The Mercers revealed the darker side of such isolation, showing how easily it could twist into pathology when pushed too far. Historians began reassessing other remote communities. What they found was complicated. Some isolated groups thrived, preserving strong cultures and resilience. Others showed the same patterns of dysfunction that consumed the Mercers. Researchers realized that isolation itself was not the real danger, ideology was. Communities that maintained some contact with the outside world, that allowed members to leave if they wished, that welcomed new blood, these communities remained healthy. Problems arose only when isolation became absolute, when outsiders were expelled, and escape was forbidden. The Mercers crossed that threshold long before any of the brothers were born. By the time they arrived, their fate was already locked in place. The institution where the brothers spent their final years closed long ago. A more modern facility replaced it, one focused on community integration rather than containment. The old building was demolished in 1988. A shopping center stands there now. No marker exists. No memorial. Nothing to remind anyone that 7 men once lived out their lives there, suffering for choices made by ancestors they would never meet. The family cemetery in the hollow is now swallowed completely by the forest. The wooden markers rotted away decades ago. Even the few stones once placed there have sunk or toppled. If Hester Mercer was eventually buried there, as her sons wished, her grave is indistinguishable from the others. The journals discovered under the floorboards now sit in archives. Most have been digitized, preserving the voices of Martha and Patience for future generations. Voices silenced for decades can finally be heard, and their warnings remain just as vital today. The Mercer brothers never chose their destiny. They lived and died inside a system engineered long before them, a system that twisted their bodies and minds, leaving them helpless in a world they were never prepared to face. Their confession was true, even if no one believed it. They were exactly what they claimed, the final result of a century of complete isolation, the last generation of a family that rejected connection and paid the ultimate price. Their story deserves remembrance, not as a curiosity or spectacle, but as a tragedy. A tragedy that might have been avoided had anyone paid closer attention to the forgotten corners of America. The Mercer brothers of Appalachia were found in 1962. Their confession went unheard. Perhaps now, after all these years, we are finally ready to listen. If you stayed until this point, it means the story truly resonated with you. Comment, I watched until the end, so I know who values the stories shared here. If the Mercer brothers' story moved you, if you want to help ensure forgotten voices are never lost again, subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Like this video if you believe tales like these should continue being told. Your support helps more people discover these hidden fragments of history. And share this video with someone who appreciates deep, human stories. The Appalachian Mountains still guard many secrets, and I'll keep searching for them, bringing them to light so the forgotten can finally be heard.